Hello, everybody. David Lombardino here, Editor-in-Chief of DLA Editors and Proofers, with part 2 in our series of tips on how to nail a virtual video interview. If you haven't checked out part 1, definitely do so. There I cover lighting, background, how to choose a camera and lens, tripods and microphones, as well as your body language for the virtual interview. In this second part, I'm going to go into detail on certain camera settings that you can adjust or manually set to get the most out of the quality of your video feed. Before I jump into the details, I'd like to mention that this video is not sponsored by any of the products that we mention or are using. Instead, we sponsor this video ourselves. If you'd like to support us, head over to www.dlaeditors.com and check out the services we offer. We offer a full range of editing, proofreading, consultation, and critique services for all aspects of your application, whether that's your personal statement, CV or resume, ARIS application, cover letter. We can even help you with writing a letter of recommendation if your recommender has asked you to do so. So head over to our website to check out the services we offer and sign up today. Now into the details. So for part 2 of these settings, I'm going to cover primarily 2 groups of settings. The first is movie recording quality, and the second is what is known as the exposure triangle. Now in this video, I'm going to be mentioning certain terms like the exposure triangle. You don't necessarily need to be familiar with those already. I'm going to be discussing the details of what you need to know and get you set up. So let's start off with the movie recording quality. Movie recording quality composes 3 parts. The first part is the frame size. The second is the frame rate. And the third is the compression. Let's start off with the frame size. So frame size, you would have heard of this. 4K, for example, is a frame size. And this is something that's popular when you're talking about like TV resolutions or computer screens, etc. So 4K is one option. You might have also heard of HD. That's another option. And then there's a third option, which is also FHD. That's how Canon calls it. Other manufacturers may refer to it a little differently. And so what you want to be thinking about is HD 720p, FHD is 1080p, and then 4K is 2040p. Now these are, depending on the camera you get, you're going to be able to choose each of these or 2 of these options. Now, so which is the best option for you? 4K offers the best clarity of picture of the 3, but it also creates the largest file size and uses the most bandwidth. What bandwidth means is the amount of data that's associated with your video that you're actually transmitting across the internet. And so part of what I'm going to be prioritizing here in discussing the movie recording quality, not just on the frame size, but in the other selections as well, is finding that right balance between the quality of the picture and having a low bandwidth to make sure that you don't have any issues with the video feed. So 4K offers the highest quality, but it is also not supported by many of the video conferencing software. For example, Zoom, which I'm using to record this video today, does not support 4K. It supports FHD or 1080p and also HD or 720p. And so you want to go for the highest available there. So 1080p is the option that I recommend for you. In a later video, I'm going to take you through the different cameras you can use for the video and show you what's different, what's not different. And there I'll show you a side-by-side comparison between 720p and 1080p. For now, what you need to know is go for 1080p. Now, you might recall that in the Zoom software, there is a setting in the options to actually activate that full HD video quality. I discussed that in part 1 of this series. So if you haven't already done so, make sure to go into your Zoom settings and activate that feature to use the full HD as opposed to just the regular HD. If you're using a different software for your video conference or your video interview, go into the settings to look at the video settings to see to make sure that you have activated the highest available definition or frame size available for you there. And so that takes care of the frame size. So the next option that we're going to talk about is frame rate. Now, frame rates appear slightly differently depending on the camera that you're using. For example, I may refer to 30 frames per second, and this may appear as actually 30 frames per second in your menu, or it may appear as 29.97 frames per second. So when I'm talking about these frames per second, keep in mind that I'm going to be referring to the round numbers, and you'll either find that exact number in your settings or one that is close to it. So generally speaking, frame rates are going to be 25 frames per second, 30 frames per second, 60, or 120. So what you want to do is you want to find the right combination between video quality and your bandwidth. 120 frames per second is a very high bandwidth option. It's also used primarily for slow motion videos. It's definitely not what you want to use here. 60 frames per second can be a good option, but again, that is likely going to require a greater bandwidth than what you're going to need. 60 frames per second is usually used when taking videos of people who are running or moving quickly or something along those lines. It's not needed for just a video interview. And so you'll want to choose between 30 and 25 frames per second. Between the two, I recommend going for 30 as it may create a smoother feed for you. In practice, you may not notice much of a difference, especially if you're not moving a lot in the video feed. So you go for either 25 or 30. Now, between 30 and 25 frames per second, there is slightly higher bandwidth with 30 frames per second. So if that's a concern, if you're running on a slower internet connection, then you may prefer to go with 25 frames per second just to ensure a smooth video feed. Finally, the last option to discuss is video compression. Video compression can appear as all-I, IPB, MPG, etc. And the ones that I want to focus on here are primarily all-I and FPB because those are likely going to be the ones that you see in your menu. The primary difference between the two is that all-I creates a larger file size or creates a larger bandwidth because those files are used for editing the video. So if you were to be creating a video and taking it into a video editing software, that gives you a lot more data to use to actually edit and make adjustments to the quality of the video, whether it's the coloring, the temperature, the brightness, etc. None of that is needed for your video interview. So go with the FPB option, which is a smaller file size, smaller data, lower bandwidth option that'll help create a smoother feed for you. Now, it may happen that in your menu, you see actually a third option where it says something like MPG or MPEG, MPEG. If you like, you can go for that. That is actually a smaller compression so that it actually can produce a smoother video. Set the setting to FPB, check the video, and then set it to MPEG and check the video and see if it makes a difference. If it doesn't, again, go with MPEG as that's going to be the smaller option. And so that wraps up the portion that talks about movie recording quality to give you the best combination of quality versus bandwidth. And now what I'm going to get into is what is known as the exposure triangle. Now the exposure triangle, aptly named, comprises three parts: the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. And each of these affects two items regarding the video feed. They all affect the brightness of the video, or how well lit it appears, and then each one affects a second item about the video quality. So first, let's talk about aperture. Aperture is basically the size of the opening inside the lens that lets the light through. The smaller the number, f2.8, for example, f1.4, f1.8, the brighter the picture and the shallower the depth of field. What I mean by depth of field is, and you can see it here in this video, I'm sharply in focus while the background is blurred out. When you're using a regular webcam, it doesn't go all the way down to f2.8. And a lot of times the background is just as sharply in focus as the subject or you on the camera. You want all the attention to be on you, so you want to choose a low f-stop number like 2.8 to make sure that you're in focus and the background is blurred out. And that'll help draw the attention to you as the one being interviewed. So the aperture controls both brightness and the shallowness of the depth of field. Shutter speed also affects brightness and in certain circumstances can affect the smoothness of the video. What I mean by that is that if you have a shutter speed that's too high or too fast, then your video feed may appear choppy. If you have it set too slow, then it will appear to be lagging or not quite in sync. And so there's a really easy rule of thumb to use. Remember the frame rate that I discussed earlier in the video. Whatever your frame rate you choose, double that, and that makes your shutter speed. So if you have chosen 30 frames per second for your frame rate, then the shutter speed you want to choose is 1/50th of a second. If you have chosen 30 frames per second for your frame rate, then the shutter speed you want to use is 1/60th of a second. Now, I know that may have gotten a little complicated. Make sure to check your camera's manual, which you can easily find online to know how to set these settings. To do so, you'll definitely want to be in manual mode. So definitely check that out in your camera's user guide. Finally, the third option for the exposure triangle is ISO. ISO affects the brightness of the video and the pixelation, if you will, of the video image. So pixelation means where a picture starts to appear really grainy. And I'm going to show you an example of that right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unplug my camera. I need to do that to change, actually I don't need to do that to change the settings, I'm sorry. Let me get that plugged back in. You do need to unplug the camera if you are going to change the movie recording quality, but if you are just changing one of the items of the exposure triangle, whether that's the aperture, the shutter speed, or the ISO, you don't need to change that. You don't need to unplug it to make that change. And so let me actually go back to Aperture and show you what it looks like to change the aperture of the camera. And so right now we've got it at f2.8, and I'm going to take it up to f8 just to show you the difference. So I can do that here by going onto my camera, and there's a little dial in the back that I can change. Take that up to f8. As you see, the picture has gotten a lot darker, and that is of course because the aperture affects both the depth of field and the brightness. And so now to compensate for what is now a very dark image, I'm going to raise my ISO. And so I currently have my ISO set at 800, and I'm going to raise that up until I get the brightness that I am looking for. So let me do that. As you see, I'm going up. Looks pretty good right there. And so I am now at ISO 4000. And so one of the things you can notice immediately is that the background is now a lot more in focus than what it was before at f2.8. What you may also notice is that the picture quality is now grainier, and it is not the same as what it was before when I had the ISO at 800 instead of having it now at 4000. And so that shows you how you can have this interplay between different parts of the exposure triangle. Your shutter speed is set according to your frame rate, as I discussed before, so that shouldn't change. Ideally, you want that aperture to be as small as possible, the number being as small as possible, so that you can get that depth of field. And then likewise, you want your ISO to be as low as possible so that you can get the highest quality image. And so let me show you, I'm going to move it back to the f2.8 aperture, and I'm going to move the ISO back to 800 where I had it. And first what I'm going to do is change the aperture or the f-stop to, so that you can see that change first. And so right now I'm at f8, so I'm going to just put this back down to f2.8. And so you can see immediately what that has done to the video feed. If I don't change the ISO and I only change the aperture, yes, I gain that depth of field. I'm now sharply in focus. The background is now blurred out, but it's far too bright. It's all washed out. And so I need to bring that ISO down to balance that out and to get the lighting or the brightness to that appropriate level. So I do that again just by going here to the ISO setting on my camera. I'm at 4,000, and I will just take that down to 800, I believe is where I had it earlier. And that is exactly right. It'll just take a moment for the camera to take that setting, and then the autofocus will come into play. And there we have the autofocus, and you can see I'm sharply in focus. The background is blurred out. One final item that I'd like to mention as kind of an addendum is the focus setting you use for your video. When you're setting up your camera, if your camera has the face detect, which I believe all the Canon cameras do that I've referred to in part 1 of this video series, if you've got the face detect or the eye detect option, use that option for your autofocus. And then that way the camera always makes sure that your face is in focus. I hope that you have found these tips useful. I know I covered a lot of items here in this video. If there's anything that you haven't understood or have questions about, definitely ask about it in the comments, and I'll be happy to answer those. Of course, if you have enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up button, share the video with your friends, subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to head over to www.dlaeditors.com to sign up for our services.